Hello and welcome. Tonight, I ask you to walk with me through a city that looks ordinary on the surface, but underneath, it hums with secrets. Picture a place where the streetlights flicker unevenly, where fog rolls thick over quiet streets, and every distant sound, a footstep, a car door closing, a dog barking suddenly seems too loud, too deliberate. This is not a tale of sudden violence or chaos. It is a story of patience, observation, and the slow, methodical unraveling of trust. Here, terror does not announce itself with shouts or explosions. It creeps, almost imperceptibly, into your life, disguised in ordinary gestures, polite smiles, and familiar faces. And it begins not with murder, but with manipulation, a subtle reshaping of reality that makes you doubt what you see, what you hear, what you trust. The man at the center of this story moved through the city as a shadow among the living. By day, he was unremarkable. A tidy suit, polite nods to neighbors, a regular at the local cafes. No one noticed the cold calculation behind the soft brown eyes, the precise timing of his interactions, the way he always seemed to be where people least expected but most needed him. It began innocuously, almost imperceptibly. A borrowed pen that vanished for a day. A lost document returned with a carefully placed comment that made the owner doubt their own memory. Small, almost invisible manipulations. A casual remark here, a planted idea there. Nothing violent, nothing that could be pinned to a crime. And yet, these tiny gestures laid the groundwork for a power more dangerous than force. The power to make people doubt themselves, to make them vulnerable without realizing it. He observed. He learned routines like a student memorizing lines for a play, the timing of people's morning commutes, the way their expressions shifted when someone entered a room, the patterns of small kindnesses extended without hesitation, the elderly neighbor who left a window unlocked for the first time in years, the waitress who always smiled at him and offered an extra coffee, the student who lingered after class to ask questions about homework. All of them were test subjects. He cataloged their vulnerabilities, their habits, their triggers. Each observation added a layer of understanding, a framework for manipulation. And he was patient. In the mind of a predator, impatience is dangerous. It risks exposure. It risks error. He waited, measured, calculated, watching the city as it unknowingly offered him the raw material for control. At first, the disturbances were subtle. People misplaced items, received strange notes, felt watched without cause. Friends noticed shifts in behavior. Colleagues commented on sudden hesitations or unexplained anxiety. Each incident seemed isolated, insignificant. No pattern was obvious, no alarm bells sounded. And yet, for those attuned to the subtle signs, there was a creeping sense that something was wrong, that reality was being gently altered just beyond their awareness. How can fear exist when nothing overtly threatens you? That is the question he exploited. Fear is most potent when it arises quietly, when it infiltrates daily life like smoke, unnoticed until it makes the lungs ache. As months passed, the subtle intrusions escalated. Phone calls in the dead of night, messages that hinted at observation, shadows glimpsed at the edge of vision, and still, law enforcement struggled. Reports came in sporadically, unconnected at first. Each officer who investigated found no clear evidence. Fingerprints were clean, surveillance footage was inconclusive, witnesses recalled events differently, as if memory itself was being manipulated. Investigators began to suspect a single mind orchestrated these acts, but the challenge was immense. The predator was careful, meticulous, every move calculated to leave traces that led nowhere, every lie layered over a kernel of truth. Could someone be this precise? Could someone blend into the fabric of society so seamlessly that the very people trying to catch him were unknowingly complicit in his manipulation? The city began to feel different. Ordinary places, cafes, parks, libraries, even classrooms seemed charged with tension. People walked a little faster, glanced over their shoulders, hesitated at familiar intersections. Even those who had not been directly affected carried an instinctive unease. Rumors began to circulate. Was someone watching? Was someone inside your home? Friends whispered of small disturbances. Colleagues mentioned fleeting glimpses of a figure just beyond vision. And always, he remained in the background, unremarkable, helpful, polite, the kind of person you would never suspect. How does someone so ordinary generate terror without ever raising suspicion? That is the question that haunted investigators, journalists, and the residents alike. The psychological profile of this predator was fascinating to experts. Unlike impulsive criminals driven by rage or opportunity, he was driven by a need for control, a need to see how far he could bend reality before it resisted. He thrived not on the immediate thrill of violence, but on the long game, the slow erosion of trust. Each manipulation was a test. Each subtle act of intimidation, a probe, measuring how people responded, learning their weaknesses, refining his methods, and he was never careless. Every social interaction, every borrowed item, every casual remark was deliberate, part of a larger pattern that remained invisible to the untrained eye. Could someone exist in society unobserved and still wield such influence? He did. Law enforcement responded with increasing intensity. Detectives set up surveillance, undercover officers were deployed, psychologists and behavioral profilers consulted. They scrutinized schedules, cross-referenced social interactions, and conducted interviews that were at once routine and probing, seeking anomalies, inconsistencies, yet each investigation hit walls. He anticipated questions, controlled conversations, presented just enough truth to appear transparent while concealing every essential detail. Every attempt to trap him revealed only the meticulous structure of his planning. He moved like a shadow, always present, yet untouchable. And then cracks began to form. A neighbor's careful observation revealed a small discrepancy, a window that should have been locked, a car parked in an unusual spot, an item discarded carelessly. Investigators pieced together these tiny anomalies, connecting threads that had once seemed unrelated. They reconstructed timelines, matched subtle manipulations to specific individuals, and slowly, the picture emerged. The realization was chilling. One mind had orchestrated months of psychological terror across an entire community, exploiting human kindness, routines, and assumptions. How do you confront someone who knows you better than you know yourself? How do you restore trust when it has been systematically dismantled? Finally, the operation to apprehend him was executed, not with guns drawn in a dramatic confrontation, but through strategy, observation, and anticipation. Every potential escape route was monitored, every decision predicted, and when he was arrested, calm and collected, polite even, the city exhaled a collective sigh of relief. Though the psychological imprint remained, the fear did not vanish. It lingered in the cautious glances, the locked doors, the distrust of strangers. What lessons remained? That monsters can wear ordinary faces, that manipulation can be more powerful than force, that fear can be implanted without ever striking a blow. Even after his capture, investigators analyzed the pattern, seeking lessons and preventive measures. Each detail revealed the depth of his calculation, the precision of his planning, the subtleties of his psychological manipulations. And, for the city, the story became a cautionary tale. Ordinary life, once taken for granted, was now understood to be fragile, susceptible to intrusion, shaped by forces that can remain unseen for months, years, perhaps indefinitely. As we reflect on this case, the question remains: how do you protect yourself from someone who operates invisibly, who exploits trust, who wields psychological insight as a weapon? How do you guard against a terror that is silent, patient, and unnoticeable until it has reshaped the world around you? In the end, it is awareness, vigilance, and understanding of human behavior that offer the only defense, because monsters do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they simply exist in plain sight, patiently waiting, observing, and learning, until fear is no longer theoretical, but woven into the fabric of everyday life. As the weeks unfolded, the city's ordinary rhythm began to feel fragile, like a glass teetering on the edge of a table. People noticed things they had never questioned before: the exact time a neighbor returned from work, the unusual angle of a car in the parking lot, the briefest glimmer of movement behind a curtain. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but collectively, These small observations seeded unease. Residents didn't know it yet, but a single mind had been tracking these patterns for months, cataloging behaviors, and learning the predictable ways in which humans act when left unaware of the scrutiny upon them. Each detail, no matter how trivial, was a thread in the web. He wove a web that would tighten invisibly, patiently, until its targets found themselves suspended in fear and doubt. He selected victims with surgical precision, each chosen for their routines, their openness to kindness, their vulnerability to subtle influence. They were neighbors who waved hello, students who stayed after class to ask a question, co-workers who trusted him without hesitation. And he approached them as one would approach a chessboard, not with overt force, but with patience and strategy. A smile here, a well-timed question there, the careful suggestion of a favor. Each interaction was calibrated to build rapport, to cultivate trust. No one ever sensed the danger. That was the genius and the horror of his method. By the time anyone realized that something was wrong, the connections had been forged, the influence exerted, and the victim was already within his sphere of control. The first tangible disturbances appeared almost innocuously: a misplaced wallet, a slightly rearranged apartment, an email that hinted at inside knowledge of private matters. The victims often questioned themselves, wondering if they had misplaced items or imagined events. How could they have known? How could anyone have observed these intimate moments without detection? The mind of the predator delighted in this uncertainty. He understood human psychology at a level few ever do, that fear can be implanted without ever raising a hand, that control can be exerted invisibly, leaving no physical trace but altering behavior and perception. It was an art form to him, a meticulous, long-running exercise in dominance over others' lives. The pattern escalated. More aggressive intrusions arrived. Phone calls at odd hours with no one speaking on the other end, letters that seemed innocuous but hinted at intimate knowledge, shadows glimpsed from apartment windows that should have been empty. Fear, once theoretical, began to infiltrate reality. People became cautious, overly attentive, sometimes paranoid. Trust began to erode, and he fed on this erosion. How long could a community maintain its composure when a hidden presence manipulated their daily lives with surgical precision? How long before doubt became terror? Law enforcement struggled with the case, caught in a labyrinth of ambiguity. Each report seemed isolated. Witnesses' recollections were inconsistent, often contradictory. No fingerprints, no video evidence that definitively identified him in acts of intrusion or manipulation. Behavioral experts were consulted, attempting to build a psychological profile, but the individual defied easy categorization. He was meticulous, observant, patient, and unerringly polite, a man whose ordinary exterior concealed a mind attuned to the nuances of fear. Each investigative step felt like a slow march against a ghost, predictable, methodical, yet frustratingly elusive. Investigators began to wonder if the perpetrator had anticipated every move they might make, if the web of surveillance they constructed only served to tighten his control further. The media soon caught wind of unusual occurrences. Local news outlets reporting missing items, unexplained disturbances, brief mentions of shadowy figures seen in neighborhoods. Each article stoked a mixture of curiosity and fear, amplifying the city's unease. Social media buzzed with speculation, rumors bloomed, and neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Ordinary locations, the school library, a favorite cafe, a quiet park, took on a new dimension of threat, their familiarity replaced by a sense of potential danger. And all the while, he remained in plain sight, participating in these environments as innocuously as ever, gaining trust even as suspicion mounted around him. Could anyone see him for what he truly was? Could anyone recognize the predator cloaked in familiarity? Among his victims, the psychological toll was profound. Many began questioning their own perceptions, their judgment, their sanity. Was the shadow in the apartment real or imagined? Had they left the door unlocked, or was someone testing them? Did the misplaced wallet truly vanish, or had they forgotten? The uncertainty was deliberate. He understood that the most effective form of control arises not from overt force, but from making people doubt themselves. Once that doubt takes root, fear grows organically. infiltrating thoughts, shaping decisions, dictating behavior. Victims avoided places they had once frequented, hesitated in routine actions, and second-guessed social interactions. Slowly, invisibly, the predator had altered the flow of daily life without ever physically intervening, without ever striking directly. And yet, the escalation continued. There were nights when residents swore they heard footsteps outside their windows, when doors that had been locked hours earlier were found slightly ajar, when messages arrived that referred to moments they could not possibly have shared. Panic began to ripple through the community. Families kept each other awake, discussing strategies for security, tracking movements of strangers, changing routines in a desperate bid for safety. Friends watched one another for signs of intrusion, colleagues noted small lapses or unusual behavior, and in this heightened state of alert, the predator thrived. Every act of precaution was anticipated, every defensive measure cataloged, every reaction a piece of the growing puzzle he used to exert control. The investigators, meanwhile, worked tirelessly, attempting to connect the dots across these disparate incidents. They interviewed dozens of witnesses, analyzed security footage for minute discrepancies, reconstructed timelines from hundreds of observations. Behavioral analysts focused on subtle cues: the cadence of speech, the selection of social targets, the manner in which trust was cultivated and exploited. But the perpetrator had thought several steps ahead. He blended observable truth with deception, misdirecting investigators while leaving subtle markers that were only noticeable in hindsight. The detective work required patience and discipline, each revelation slowly peeling back layers of obfuscation, each breakthrough tempered by the understanding that one misstep could allow him to vanish once again. The turning point came unexpectedly. A young woman, a graduate student, noticed an inconsistency, a shadow cast in a photograph she had taken outside her apartment, one that should have been empty at that hour. Something about the angle, the timing, the reflection in the window suggested an awareness of her actions she had never permitted. She reported the observation to police, not certain what it meant, but instinctively knowing it mattered. Investigators began cross-referencing her claim with previous anomalies: phone logs, neighbor statements, minor disturbances that had once seemed isolated. A pattern began to emerge, subtle yet undeniable. A single mind had orchestrated months of manipulation, observation, and psychological terror across the city. The scope was terrifying. As investigators closed in, the predator's tactics shifted. He became more cautious, more calculating, altering routines and introducing misdirection. Yet, in his desire for control, he could not entirely resist subtle provocations. The thrill of testing limits, the satisfaction of observing a carefully cultivated fear manifest in real time. Internal monologues reconstructed later through interviews and psychological analysis revealed a mind attuned to the smallest human reactions. Every hesitation, every glance, every question was data. He measured the efficacy of his manipulations like a scientist, adjusting his approach, refining strategies, anticipating responses. How can law enforcement confront someone who seems to anticipate every move before it is made? How can a community reclaim trust when the architect of fear knows its every fissure? Finally, after months of painstaking observation and strategic planning, authorities coordinated an operation. Surveillance was synchronized, undercover agents placed in key locations, potential escape routes monitored, every movement predicted with painstaking accuracy. And then, in a quiet moment, he was apprehended. The arrest was unremarkable in appearance. A man, calm and polite, compliant, still blending with ordinary society even as officers led him away. But the psychological impact remained profound. For months, the city had been under the silent pressure of his manipulations. Now, the relief was mixed with lingering doubt, lingering suspicion, and an awareness that ordinary life could be quietly subverted by a mind like his. The aftermath became a study in human vulnerability. Investigators meticulously analyzed his methods, reconstructing the months of careful observation, deception, and psychological influence. The media covered the story extensively, dissecting each manipulation, highlighting the subtlety of his tactics, and emphasizing the danger of the invisible predator who thrives not on violence but on fear itself. Residents reflected on their own routines, questioned the assumptions of daily life, and reconsidered the meaning of trust. For those who had been victims, the emotional scars were long-lasting, a reminder that terror does not require bloodshed to be devastating. In the weeks and months that followed, psychological experts offered insights into his motivations. Unlike impulsive criminals, his acts were deliberate, strategic, and deeply rooted in the understanding of human behavior. He was fascinated by the fragility of perception, the ease with which routine could be manipulated, and the power inherent in the subtle erosion of confidence. He did not seek notoriety. He sought mastery, control, the quiet dominance that comes from shaping reality in a way that leaves no visible trace. And for those studying the case, the lessons were chilling. Ordinary environments are vulnerable, everyday kindness can be exploited, and fear, when deployed carefully, is more potent than violence. By the time the city began to recover, it had been fundamentally altered. Empty streets felt different. Shadows seemed longer. Familiar places carried new weight. Trust, once assumed, had to be rebuilt. And while the predator now faced legal consequences, the community carried forward an enduring awareness that evil does not always announce itself. It can exist quietly, patiently, blending seamlessly with ordinary life, measuring reactions, and exploiting vulnerabilities until fear is no longer an abstraction, but an omnipresent reality. The story lingers, a lesson etched in the psyche of a city and its residents. Vigilance, awareness, and understanding of human psychology are vital defenses against the invisible threats that can enter everyday life. Because sometimes the most dangerous predators are not those who strike violently, but those who shape their world from the shadows. Patient, deliberate, and terrifyingly ordinary. As the investigation deepened, the city felt the invisible weight of his presence more acutely than ever before. Even with the predator in custody, the patterns he had established lingered, like echoes in an empty hallway. Each victim's mind was a battlefield of doubt and fear, their memories of small disturbances now amplified into a mosaic of anxiety. How could a misplaced letter or a shadow outside a window shake the sense of security so profoundly? What did it mean to live in a city where everyday gestures, the casual wave of a neighbor, the friendly conversation with a colleague could be exploited with such precision? Psychologists would later describe these effects as psychological residue, the lingering impact of manipulation that leaves its mark long after the manipulator is gone. He had operated with a precision that made even seasoned investigators question their assumptions about criminal behavior. Unlike violent criminals driven by impulse, his actions were strategic, carefully measured, and deliberately invisible. He understood social dynamics at an almost uncanny level, the way humans instinctively trust patterns, overlook anomalies, and fill in gaps in perception with comforting assumptions. He exploited these tendencies with a patient, meticulous hand. Friends of victims recalled casual remarks that later seemed laden with meaning, favors offered that subtly increased dependence, suggestions that seeded doubt about others. Each act was seemingly insignificant on its own, but collectively formed a network of influence that kept his targets in a constant state of mild anxiety. Victims' stories revealed the psychological toll of his manipulations. One woman described feeling constantly watched, yet no evidence of surveillance was ever found. She recounted nights lying awake, listening for sounds she could not identify, doubting her own perceptions. A young man reported receiving messages that referenced private conversations he had had in confidence, though he had no reason to believe they could have been intercepted. Others noticed that items in their homes seemed to shift subtly. Books moved, personal objects misplaced without any logical explanation. And through it all, the man remained unobserved, an ordinary presence in the background, his face familiar, his demeanor polite, even helpful. Law enforcement faced enormous challenges. The lack of physical evidence, the careful construction of his public persona, and the unpredictability of human perception all complicated the case. Detectives struggled with witness statements that often contradicted each other, timelines that did not initially align, and security footage that revealed little more than fleeting shadows. Profilers worked to construct a psychological map, analyzing subtle patterns of behavior, social targeting, and the manipulation of trust. They noted that his methods were almost surgical, small, deliberate actions designed to shape perception and influence behavior without detection. Each success reinforced his sense of control, and investigators knew they were dealing with someone who understood not only the law, but human nature itself. The media, of course, heightened public anxiety. As reports of strange disturbances, missing items, and shadowy figures circulated, fear spread rapidly. News outlets emphasized the unknown, the unseen, the subtle threat that had existed for months before anyone realized it. Headlines suggested omnipresence, the shadow among us, a predator in plain sight, fear without form. Social media amplified speculation. Rumors flourished, and ordinary residents began to monitor their neighbors and colleagues with a new vigilance. The city had become a theater of tension, and every passerby a potential character in his silent drama. His manipulations extended beyond physical spaces. He leveraged technology to reinforce his presence, carefully timing messages and calls, observing social media patterns, and exploiting the predictability of digital communication. Victims reported receiving texts and emails that suggested he knew intimate details of their lives, though no one could trace their source. Each act reinforced the notion that he could see beyond ordinary perception, that the ordinary world had been subtly rewritten according to his design. And in this, he achieved a psychological domination far greater than brute force could provide, the ability to make others doubt their own reality. Investigators worked tirelessly to predict his behavior, constructing scenarios that might provoke errors. Undercover officers were placed in his usual haunts, but he adapted quickly, altering his patterns just enough to avoid detection. Surveillance teams monitored potential locations, noting even the slightest deviations. Behavioral analysts focused on microexpressions, speech patterns, and body language, attempting to anticipate the next step in a game played entirely within the mind. Every move, every pause, every minor deviation was cataloged, forming the foundation of a complex strategy designed to bring him into the light without endangering victims or losing the trail. The killer's internal monologue, reconstructed through later interviews and psychological analysis, revealed a mind attuned to the smallest details of human interaction. He contemplated each person he observed as a puzzle, each social setting as a laboratory, each action as a controlled experiment. He noted reactions, hesitation, discomfort, and compliance, adjusting his behavior to maximize influence and minimize exposure. He did not act out of hatred or rage. Rather, he was fascinated by control, by the subtle art of shaping reality to serve his own purposes. The thrill was in observation, in manipulation, in the slow unraveling of certainty in others. Violence, if necessary, was secondary to the primary objective: dominion over perception. In this way, months passed without anyone fully comprehending the breadth of his activities. Each victim felt isolated, unsure whether their experiences were unique or part of a larger pattern. Family members noticed changes in behavior, withdrawal, hypervigilance, insomnia, but could not connect these effects to the subtle intrusions. Investigators, piecing together fragments of evidence, began to see a tapestry emerge, a network of manipulations, all stemming from a single orchestrator. The realization was terrifying. One mind had effectively controlled, frightened, and influenced an entire community without the need for overt violence. When the investigation finally yielded a break, it came not from dramatic confrontation, but from meticulous attention to detail. A discarded piece of evidence, a subtle observation from a vigilant neighbor, a timestamp that didn't align, all converged to provide a clear link to the perpetrator. Law enforcement moved carefully, understanding that a misstep could allow him to disappear once more. The coordination was exhaustive. Surveillance synchronized across multiple locations, contingencies planned for every conceivable scenario, and teams prepared to respond instantly to deviation from expected patterns. The arrest itself was anticlimactic in its calmness. The man, composed and polite, presented no resistance, blending seamlessly with ordinary citizens around him. And yet, the psychological impact of his capture was profound. Residents felt a mixture of relief and lingering unease. They had been living in a city under subtle siege, and even in his absence, the memory of manipulation and uncertainty remained. The media analyzed every aspect of the case, emphasizing not just his actions but the chilling effectiveness of psychological control, the danger of the ordinary disguised as ordinary, the way trust can be weaponized without leaving visible scars. In the aftermath, the city grappled with the enduring psychological imprint. Victims received counseling, investigators reviewed protocols, and experts discussed the subtle power of manipulation and fear. People reconsidered their assumptions about safety, trust, and the ordinary interactions that define daily life. Lessons were learned, but the shadow of uncertainty remained. Residents could not unsee the vulnerability that had been exploited, nor easily restore the sense of normalcy that had been quietly eroded. The predator's mind, finally constrained by custody, became a subject of intense study. Experts explored his meticulous planning, his understanding of human behavior, his patient manipulation of perception. He had anticipated nearly every possible reaction, measured human response with precision, and adjusted strategies in real time. His crimes demonstrated that terror does not always require overt violence. It can be embedded in social structures, relationships, and the invisible architecture of daily life. Understanding his methods was as critical as understanding his motives. The broader implications were chilling. How many ordinary interactions carry hidden risks? How often do subtle manipulations occur unnoticed? How fragile is the sense of security in daily life when someone with knowledge, patience, and insight chooses to exploit it? These questions haunted investigators, psychologists, and residents alike. They highlighted the thin line between ordinary life and psychological control, the ease with which trust and routine can be weaponized. As time passed, the city began to rebuild a sense of normalcy, but with caution. Residents modified routines, adopted new security measures, and scrutinized interactions more carefully. Schools, workplaces, and public spaces implemented protocols to mitigate subtle psychological threats. Yet the memory of manipulation lingered, the small moments of doubt, the fear that had been cultivated invisibly, the awareness that one could be observed and influenced without knowledge or consent. The predator had left an indelible mark, not through violence, but through a mastery of human perception and the artful exploitation of ordinary life. Even in custody, his influence persisted, if only in the stories shared by victims and in the collective memory of the city. The man who had walked unnoticed among them, patient, calculating, and psychologically astute, became a case study in the power of subtle control, a warning of the vulnerabilities inherent in everyday life, and a reminder that true terror does not always arrive in the form of screams or bloodshed. Sometimes it arrives quietly, patiently, in the ordinary, in ways almost impossible to detect until the effects are fully realized. Investigation unfolded. The city had already begun to feel the weight of collective unease. Streets that had once carried the hum of ordinary life now seemed charged, every movement amplified, every shadow scrutinized. Residents no longer walked with casual ease. They lingered near streetlights, paused at intersections, and peered into shop windows as if expecting to see someone watching. The predator's influence had created an invisible grid of tension, one that extended beyond direct victims to an entire community, infecting daily routines with doubt and vigilance. And though he was now in custody, the effects of months of subtle manipulations persisted, like a storm whose winds had passed but whose clouds still loomed overhead. Investigators worked tirelessly to unravel the full scope of his actions, realizing that each minor incident, an out-of-place item, a misplaced letter, a mysterious phone call was a deliberate component of a much larger, more complex plan. It was no longer enough to document what he had done. They needed to understand why, to reconstruct the invisible architecture of his manipulations, to identify the precise mechanisms through which he had gained control over perception and trust. The detective teams pored over hundreds of interviews, cross-referenced timelines, analyzed security footage frame by frame, and consulted behavioral experts to map the patterns that had once seemed random. Every subtle clue became a thread, woven into a tapestry of methodical control. Victims described the persistent psychological toll in vivid terms. One woman recounted how she would avoid leaving her apartment after dark, imagining shadows moving in synchrony with her every step. A man reported the incessant feeling of being watched, even in public spaces crowded with strangers. Families spoke of the strain within their homes, tension growing as they questioned their own judgments, each minor anomaly amplified into evidence of unseen surveillance. The predator's genius lay in this ability to manipulate perception. He had not struck with force, yet he had shaped reality to serve his objectives, leaving psychological scars that would take years to heal. Meanwhile, the media frenzy escalated. Newspapers, television broadcasts, and social media channels dissected every facet of the case, often blurring the line between reporting and spectacle. Headlines emphasized omnipresence and stealth, the man who knows everything, invisible predator, fear without form. Experts were invited to speak on camera, analyzing his methods and speculating about the psychological profile, while ordinary citizens recounted experiences that mirrored the subtle manipulations he had used. Public anxiety intensified, feeding a feedback loop that mirrored the predator's own strategy. Uncertainty and doubt spread faster than any single act of intrusion could. Investigators faced the formidable challenge of translating theoretical insights into practical action. Every detail mattered: the timing of communications, the subtle manipulation of social interactions, the predictable ways in which humans respond to authority and familiarity. Undercover officers were embedded in locations he frequented, each interaction carefully scripted to test hypotheses about his behavior. Surveillance units tracked minute deviations from routine, cataloging microexpressions, patterns of movement, and the subtle markers of control he left in his wake. The operation became a combination of psychological analysis, behavioral prediction, and meticulous fieldwork, each aspect reinforcing the others in a delicate balance designed to finally bring clarity to months of uncertainty. Through reconstructed internal monologues and interviews, investigators pieced together a remarkable portrait of his mind. He approached life as a controlled experiment, each individual a subject whose behavior could be observed, analyzed, and influenced. He measured responses to subtle provocation, adjusting techniques to maximize compliance and psychological impact. He did not seek chaos for its own sake. He sought the slow, steady erosion of confidence and trust, the quiet transformation of ordinary life into a stage upon which he could exercise control. Each act, no matter how small, was calculated to reinforce the perception of omnipresence and the inevitability of influence. The predator's manipulations began to grow bolder as the investigation progressed. While outwardly compliant and cooperative, he experimented with subtle psychological provocation, testing how far he could push the boundaries without exposure. He created moments that seemed coincidental but were meticulously designed to heighten fear. A shadow passing near a window, a message appearing at a precisely calculated time, the movement of objects that victims relied upon daily. Each experiment produced data that he collected and analyzed, refining his understanding of human perception and the fragile structures of trust upon which ordinary life depended. As the operation approached its climax, tension reached an apex. Investigators coordinated across multiple teams, preparing contingency plans for every scenario. Surveillance cameras were monitored continuously, physical checkpoints established, undercover agents positioned strategically, and digital traces scrutinized in real time. The predator, attuned to the rhythms of human behavior, began to adjust subtly, but the investigative teams anticipated these shifts, using predictive modeling to forecast his likely actions. It became a high-stakes psychological chess game, one in which a single miscalculation could allow months of careful work to unravel. Victims' accounts provided crucial insight into the patterns of manipulation. Each story revealed a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, a deliberate use of trust, familiarity, and predictability as instruments of control. Friends and family members described changes in behavior that were gradual yet profound: avoidance of certain locations, hesitation in social interactions, and almost obsessive attention to detail in daily routines. The predator had not merely observed, he had orchestrated, crafting an environment in which fear and doubt were constant companions, shaping the community's behavior without ever drawing attention to himself. Media coverage, while sometimes sensationalized, inadvertently contributed to the understanding of his methods. Journalists traced patterns, highlighting recurring anomalies and compiling timelines that proved invaluable to investigators. Public fascination with the case grew, blending fear with curiosity and creating a societal mirror of the psychological manipulations he had employed. The city itself had become a laboratory, its residents unwitting participants in a prolonged study of perception, trust, and the subtle dynamics of control. Through the painstaking analysis of behavior, investigators identified the turning points that allowed the predator's influence to take hold. Each minor act of manipulation, rearranged items, carefully timed messages, subtle provocations, was a deliberate test of human reaction. Victims' responses, cataloged in interviews and cross-referenced with surveillance data, revealed predictable patterns that the predator had exploited. He understood that ordinary people rely on consistency and routine, that deviations from expectation create anxiety, and that fear, when administered gradually, can exert a profound influence without the need for overt violence. The culmination of months of meticulous work approached. Investigators coordinated a simultaneous series of operations designed to limit movement, prevent observation of law enforcement strategy, and create an environment in which the predator's ability to manipulate would be constrained. Contingencies accounted for every known behavior, with redundancy built into the system to counter any unforeseen reactions. The operation was a fusion of behavioral science, logistical planning, and tactical precision, each element carefully designed to neutralize the threat while minimizing risk to the public. As the arrest drew near, the psychological tension was palpable. Investigators observed every nuance, measuring the predator's responses, anticipating adjustments, and preparing to act decisively at the exact moment of opportunity. The months of subtle terror, the manipulation of perception, the orchestrated fear that had permeated the city, were all poised to end not in spectacle but in a precise, controlled intervention. When the moment arrived, officers moved simultaneously, executing the plan with flawless coordination. The predator was apprehended quietly, compliant and unassuming, the ordinary facade intact even as the operation concluded. The aftermath left the city grappling with the psychological imprint of months of manipulation. Residents spoke of lingering unease, of the challenge of restoring trust, of the difficulty of distinguishing between ordinary life and potential intrusion. Experts highlighted the case as a study in the power of subtle control, emphasizing that terror can exist without visible violence and that ordinary behavior can be weaponized through patient observation and strategic influence. The lessons were profound. Vigilance, understanding of human behavior, and recognition of subtle manipulation were essential to maintaining security in everyday life. Even after custody, the predator's influence persisted in collective memory. Victims recounted experiences that seemed trivial at the time, but, in hindsight, revealed a pattern of deliberate manipulation. Investigators documented these patterns meticulously, creating a comprehensive record of the methods used to exploit trust, perception, and routine. Media coverage reinforced public awareness, while psychologists and criminologists studied the implications for both personal safety and broader societal resilience. The city itself had been irrevocably altered, a living testament to the power of subtle, patient control. In the end, the story stands not only as a record of criminal behavior, but as a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust and perception. Monsters do not always announce themselves with violence. Sometimes they observe, wait, and shape reality from the shadows. And sometimes, the most profound terror arises not from what is done to the body, but from what is done to the mind. The careful erosion of certainty, the subtle orchestration of doubt, the transformation of ordinary life into a landscape of fear. For the residents, investigators, and victims, the experience left an indelible mark, a reminder that vigilance, awareness, and understanding are the only defenses against those who manipulate invisibly, patiently, and with extraordinary insight into the human psyche. With the predator finally in custody, the city experienced a mixture of relief, disbelief, and a lingering, almost tangible unease. The streets were no longer actively manipulated, yet the psychological imprint of months of subtle terror persisted. Residents walked with heightened awareness, instinctively checking over their shoulders, reevaluating old routines, and questioning the ordinary interactions they once took for granted. What had seemed mundane, a neighbor smile, a friendly wave, a casual conversation, was now scrutinized for potential manipulation. The predator had not only altered behavior, but had permanently reshaped perception, leaving a community wary of the familiar. Investigators began reconstructing the full chronology of his manipulations, delving into every nuance of his methodology. They cataloged hundreds of subtle acts, letters left at precise times, messages that referenced private conversations, shadows observed in peripheral vision, items moved slightly to test attention, and carefully timed appearances that seemed coincidental but were meticulously orchestrated. Each act was documented and analyzed, revealing a level of planning that approached obsessive precision. Behavioral analysts emphasized the extraordinary patience and psychological insight required to manipulate so many individuals simultaneously without detection. Victims' testimonies became central to understanding the extent of his influence. One young woman recounted how she had avoided certain streets for weeks, convinced that he might be watching, though he had never been physically present in those locations. A man described nights spent checking locks obsessively, following routines designed to protect himself and his family from a threat he could not see. Families described tension-filled dinners where ordinary disagreements were colored by underlying fear and hypervigilance. The predator's genius lay in creating an environment in which the ordinary became suspect, where reality itself seemed mutable, and the mind became a theater for subtle terror. Media coverage intensified, chronicling the months of manipulation in minute detail. Reporters reconstructed incidents, analyzing patterns, interviewing victims, and presenting psychological insights from experts. Headlines reflected both fascination and horror. The invisible architect of fear, how one man controlled a city, the subtle predator. Social media amplified the story further, with residents sharing personal anecdotes, scrutinizing every detail of the case, and debating the methods used to maintain control without overt violence. The public engagement created a feedback loop reminiscent of the predator's own strategy, uncertainty and fear spreading faster than any single act could. Law enforcement reflected on the challenges of the case, recognizing that traditional investigative methods had been insufficient against such a meticulous manipulator. The absence of conventional evidence, fingerprints, eyewitness confirmation, surveillance footage highlighted the limitations of relying solely on physical data. Instead, the investigation depended on careful observation of behavioral patterns, subtle inconsistencies, and predictive analysis. Detectives and analysts worked in concert to anticipate psychological moves, reconstruct his strategies, and identify the small errors that eventually led to his capture. The case became a landmark study in the application of behavioral science to criminal investigation. During the trial, the predator's composure remained unnervingly calm. He appeared polite, articulate, and entirely ordinary, almost incongruously so given the scope of his manipulations. Prosecutors presented extensive evidence detailing his months-long orchestration of fear, including timelines, psychological profiles, and testimony from victims who described the subtle yet pervasive impact on their lives. Defense attorneys struggled to counter the narrative. The absence of direct physical violence complicated their arguments, yet the psychological consequences were undeniable. The court was presented with a chilling portrait of a man who had achieved dominion over perception itself, using insight, patience, and careful observation as tools of control. Throughout the proceedings, psychologists provided detailed analyses of his methods. They described the systematic cultivation of trust, the precise timing of manipulations, and the subtle orchestration of doubt and anxiety. Experts emphasized that the absence of overt violence did not diminish the impact of his actions. Rather, it enhanced the psychological power of the manipulations. Victims had internalized the fear, their routines and perceptions permanently altered, illustrating that the mind itself could be weaponized with patience, intelligence, and meticulous planning. The courtroom became a theater in which the mechanisms of invisible terror were laid bare, demonstrating how ordinary life could be rendered uncertain by one person's understanding of human behavior. The media coverage of the trial extended beyond local boundaries. National and international outlets analyzed the case, emphasizing the unique nature of the crimes. Documentaries and news features highlighted not just the events themselves, but the underlying psychological strategies presenting the predator as a case study in subtle manipulation and control. Public discourse expanded to include discussions of trust, vulnerability, and the unseen ways in which ordinary environments could be exploited. The narrative became more than a crime story. It was a cautionary tale about the fragility of perception, the power of patience, and the potential for ordinary individuals to wield extraordinary psychological influence. In the community, recovery was gradual. Residents participated in workshops and counseling programs designed to rebuild confidence and restore a sense of safety. Schools, workplaces, and community organizations implemented protocols to detect subtle manipulations, encourage vigilance, and promote psychological resilience. Ordinary interactions were once again approached with cautious openness, a balance between trust and awareness. The predator's influence had exposed vulnerabilities that were previously invisible, and the process of rebuilding trust became both a personal and societal endeavor. Victims reflected on the long-term effects of their experiences. Many reported persistent hypervigilance, difficulty trusting strangers, and heightened sensitivity to minor anomalies in daily life. Some described an obsessive need to control their surroundings, ensuring that every variable was accounted for, mirroring, in a sense, the meticulous observation they had experienced from the predator. Psychologists emphasized that recovery involved more than reassurance. It required a conscious reconstruction of perception, an acknowledgement of the subtle erosion of trust, and the development of coping strategies to prevent residual fear from dictating behavior. The predator, confined and studied, provided invaluable insights into human psychology and the mechanisms of control. Researchers examined his methods, motivations, and cognitive patterns, seeking to understand how one individual could orchestrate months of pervasive manipulation without detection. They noted his capacity for strategic patience, meticulous observation, and adaptive behavior, recognizing the rarity of such psychological acuity applied to the orchestration of fear. The case became a reference point for law enforcement, psychologists, and criminologists, illustrating the profound effects of manipulation in the absence of physical violence. As the legal process concluded, the city continued to grapple with the lessons learned. Residents adjusted routines, reinforced security measures, and cultivated a heightened awareness of human behavior. Schools integrated educational programs on personal safety and social dynamics, workplaces emphasized vigilance and reporting protocols, and community forums encouraged dialogue about trust, perception, and psychological resilience. The predator's impact extended beyond individual victims to a societal understanding of the vulnerabilities inherent in everyday life. Ultimately, the story of this predator stands as a stark reminder. True terror does not always manifest through physical violence. It can emerge silently, patiently, and invisibly, shaping perception, influencing behavior, and eroding trust without leaving visible scars. The most dangerous threats are not always those that announce themselves with spectacle. Often, they exist in plain sight, operating in the spaces between routine and observation, waiting for the subtle openings that human psychology provides. The predator's methods revealed that ordinary life contains inherent vulnerabilities, and that awareness, vigilance, and understanding are essential defenses against manipulation. For the victims, the city, and those who studied the case, the enduring lesson is clear. Trust is fragile, perception is malleable, and patience can be a weapon more devastating than force. By the time the predator was finally held accountable, the psychological landscape of the community had been irrevocably altered. The subtle terror he had wrought left an indelible mark, demonstrating the extraordinary power of observation, the profound effects of manipulation, and the enduring vulnerability of ordinary human life. And so, the city moved forward, cautious but aware, carrying the memory of invisible terror as both a warning and a guide. The predator's actions served as a testament to the fact that control does not require physical dominance. Mastery over perception and influence over thought can be equally devastating. Residents, investigators, psychologists, and the broader public were left to reconcile the ordinary with the extraordinary, the familiar with the unseen, and the subtle manipulation of human behavior with the structures of everyday life. In the end, the story is not simply about a single man, his manipulations, or his capture. It is about the delicate architecture of trust, the invisible threads that connect people, and the ways in which perception can be shaped, exploited, and weaponized. It is about vigilance, resilience, and the understanding that fear can exist without a visible threat, that terror can operate quietly, patiently, and invisibly, and that ordinary life, while seemingly mundane, is never truly immune from the extraordinary insights of those who study and manipulate human behavior. As we reflect on this case, we are left with a lingering question. How many other predators operate unseen, patiently, and with calculated insight into human nature? How often do we unknowingly allow our routines, our assumptions, and our trust to be manipulated, measured, and exploited? And most importantly, how do we cultivate awareness and resilience in a world where subtle psychological control can be as powerful and as terrifying as any visible threat? The story of this predator, his victims, and the city he controlled serves as a chilling reminder that true vigilance begins not with fear of the visible, but with understanding of the invisible.